Well, hi everyone. Welcome to today's video. We are delighted to have all the way from Texas with us today, Leighton Flowers, and we'll be chatting about evangelism, apologetics, and all things important to the modern church, whether they be evangelical, Protestant, or whatever. But anyway, let's crack in. Well, like I said before, it was almost before we were, I was going to say in the green room. We don't really have any colors here in these virtual studios. But Leighton, happy, well, we're in spring. That means you guys must be getting into fall by now, if I get my...
It still feels like summer here though, Phil.
Oh,
It's in the mid 90s right now in the afternoon, and so usually by the end of September it starts to cool off. But this summer has been somewhat relentless. We've had up in the 105, 108 degrees all throughout August, many days in a row over 100 degrees, and I am ready for the fall. I'm ready for fall weather.
Yeah.
Well, what's 100 again in Celsius? Just for the people who don't.
I would ask you guys. Yeah,
I think it's
Americans don't know those kinds of things. You know better than to ask us that. we expect everybody. We expect everybody to conform to English. We expect everybody to know inches and yards and feet, and we expect everybody to know Fahrenheit. That's just that's us Americans. That's what we expect.
Normal body temperature, Leighton. What's normal body temperature in Fahrenheit?
98.6 would be our normal body picture.
So
yeah.
Over 100.
So you're into the 40s then, yeah.
40s. Wow, that's
I mean, it gets that way here in Australia quite easily. Of course, further inland you get. I mean, at the dead center of Australia, you can get into high 40s, 50s, which would that be 120, maybe 125. Sort of, it'd be very. But here in Coffs, we live in a sort of, I don't know, in a bit of a tiny little because we're part of the coast that's surrounded by mountains, so we've got this what we call subtropical climate. So it's wetter here all throughout the year, and that's only in comparison to the rest of Australia. Australia is not the country that we live through lots of droughts usually, but this spot is very green all year round pretty much, and moderate climate, as in moderate again in terms of Australia, but a lot of people come to retire here. It's probably a bit like Florida in climate wise from Australia.
Like Florida, but with a governor like California.
No.
Anyway, it's a little bit painful. I wonder if you would take us on a bit of a tour, particularly for our Aussie and Kiwi folks who probably don't know much about you and your work, although we are more familiar. Can you just fill us in on your role as Director of Evangelism and Apologetics? Where it fits and how big your scope and your role is?
Yeah, I work with Texas Baptist, and it's a denominational organization for the state of Texas. We have close to 6,000 churches in our convention.
Wow.
And we help to organize events for them, evangelism events, training in apologetics. Matter of fact, this coming weekend, it's called a Recharge. There's a Recharge event that that Tim is putting on, who's on our team. I've got about eight folks on my team that work with me individually, doing all kinds of ministries and outreach and trainings and resources, creating new resources, writing materials, curriculum, all kinds of things. And so I love what I get to do. I've been a part of Texas Baptist since 2003. And almost a little over 20 years now that I've been a part of Texas Baptist, and so I've loved every minute of it, and love what I get to do. Now, what a lot of people know me for online is the thing I created on the side called Sociology 101, and that is kind of a passion project of mine, so to speak, because I wrote my dissertation on really on the doctrines of grace with regard to salvation, the doctrine of soteriology. I was a Calvinist for a good 10 years of my life and ended up leaving Calvinism, even though I have a lot of really close, good friends that are Calvinistic still.
Sure.
But I was convinced that Calvinism wasn't true, and so I wrote my dissertation on kind of my journey out of Calvinism and the rise of Calvinism within the Southern Baptist Convention, where I'm a part of. And then that led to the starting of the podcast. And I kind of created it off to the side because I didn't want it to really disrupt my evangelism ministry, my apologetics ministry. And it's become more popular, at least around the world, than my evangelism stuff, just because of the nature of the nature of a conflict and those kinds of things. People like to debate that issue, and so it's become pretty well known just through the YouTube page and the broadcast that a lot of people are familiar with now.
Yeah, the anything that's a bit clickbaity does tend to draw the algorithm if there's a conflict there. So with, and I think that's a very interesting area to talk about. And maybe if there's a little bit of time towards the end, we'll come back to the Soteriology 101 material. But with the work that you're focused on, your primary work, what's the what is, I guess, the driving force and the goals and the effect of what you and your folks are trying to achieve there?
Well, we exist for the church. You know, a lot of times you'll see within the more of a Catholic structures, more of a hierarchy. Like you know, the smaller churches report to the Vatican kind of thing. The Vatican's the one who passes down the edicts of what the churches, local churches, are to believe and do. In the Baptist world, it's the autonomy of the local church, the priesthood of every believer, and so it's more of a bottom up than a top down. And we serve the church, and so they give to support the different missions and ministries across the state of Texas as well around the world. And so we've got foreign missionaries as well as statewide missionaries, national missionaries are all supported through the Texas Baptist Cooperative Program and Mary Hill Davis offerings that people give through their churches, their local churches. And so the area that I'm in charge of is over evangelism and apologetics. And those really go hand in hand. We see those as two sides of one coin because it's the proclamation of the truth, which is what evangelism is all about. But apologetics is giving a defense for why we believe what we believe. And so it's not obviously apologizing like you're apologizing for your faith, but instead it's giving a defense for your faith is really what apologia, the original Greek word, means, to give a defense for why we believe what we believe, which is all the more necessary in our culture today, for sure.
Can I ask a quick question? So in terms of apologetics, this is more of a personal question to you, I guess, but would you call yourself an evidentialist, a classicalist, or a presuppositionalist?
More of a classical and more of an evidentialist. I mean, more in that realm than a presuppositionalist. There's a lot of discussion about those things, but
there is.
I always like to say that I like all the tools in my tool belt. And so there's actually some presuppositional arguments, evidential arguments, more of a classical approach arguments that are all useful. And, in other words, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can kind of strain through and find the best of all the world, so to speak. And it oftentimes depends on who you're talking to as to which tool to use. So if you're, for example, you're talking to somebody who already agrees with your presupposition that the Bible is God's word, then you can start with the basis of appealing to the scriptures to help you in your evangelism or in your apologetic efforts, obviously. But I don't think we're in a world anymore where you can just presume that somebody believes that the word of God is authoritative or that the Bible is God's word at all. No. And that apologetics is helping to defend the reason we believe it is God's word, and it helps to explain we have really good reasons for believing that the Bible is inspired, and that it is God's truth given to us, and that Jesus truly is the Son of God and did die and rose again. There's good evidence for that, and we think people should know about those things.
Yeah. Look, I agree. I mean, I've got an apologetics degree, and I'm quite interested in this kind of ongoing debate. It's kind of a debate that happens on the fringes, and you'll see people in all sorts of camps, irrespective of what church denomination they are. You'll find a broad range of different people with different ideas about apologetics in all the different denominations. But I find it troubling when some people sort of have this kind of myopic view that, I'm a presuppositionalist in opposition to everybody else who, almost, there are some extremes in those camps that I think are more than anything unhelpful, because me personally, I'm convinced by the logical arguments for the faith, and even though I think there are some good things about the presuppositional, like I've read Van Til's work, and I think there's a lot of compelling arguments in there.
Yes,
But
there is.
it didn't convince me that he was right to the exclusion of everybody else being wrong, kind of thing. I think that's often a bad way to look at it, and so I'm always interested to see what people think.
Yeah.
I think that leads us to our second guiding question. And again, this is just sort of a bit of a theme for us to follow while we're on track, Leighton and Steve as well. What is effective evangelism and why? I mean, it's something I believe, in the literature, you come out with these things called boundary terms or boundary words where people use it, and they all have their own definition of what they're using, but they're not actually using it the same way. So it helps enable a conversation, but it's not always an effective conversation because we often mean different things. So from a, Texas Baptist point of view, effective evangelism, what is it?
Yeah, I think following obviously the example of Christ is probably a good way to go. It's pretty safe. In other words, you want your evangelism to have effect. You want your evangelism to work. You want to convince others of the truthfulness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so you as Paul said, by whatever means that I can possibly, I become all things to all men, by all means to win some. And there is a desire, I think, on the part of Christians, especially those with an evangelistic heart, to win others. And I see a good example of this, for example, in Matthew 9:35, when it says that Jesus goes through the towns and villages, he's teaching in the synagogues, and he's proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. But then he also says, it goes on to say, healing every kind of disease and sickness. And so what I see there is kind of a twofold effort in evangelism, is meeting people at their point of need. In other words, he doesn't say, just come to where I'm comfortable. He's going into their villages, into their synagogues. He's going to where they are, and he's finding what their needs are. He doesn't know what their diseases and their sicknesses are unless he's getting his hands dirty. He's got to be there with them. He's got to know what's going on in their life. He's got to be willing to help meet their needs in order for them to be willing to hear and to listen to the truth of the gospel. And I think that's very true in our culture and our world today, that people, as popularly said, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Both are important, by the way. The things that you say and know are important, but also the fact that you care for them. You're not just giving them a sales pitch. You're not just trying to convince them to convert into your religion, but instead you genuinely care about their health and their well-being and most importantly their soul. And so I think that's effective evangelism, is whenever it's driven out of a motivation of love and caring for the person, and that you're willing to meet them at their point of need, and to help meet their needs in order to bring the good news. Sometimes churches and ministries can become imbalanced if they leave one of those two out. I've seen both of those, where you see people just shouting people down, trying to kind of beat them over the head with the Bible. In other words, they're proclaiming the good news, but they're not showing any kind of care for the needs of the people that they're shouting down. And then you've got the other kind that become really good at putting shoes on people's feet, for example, or feeding the hungry, or building houses, or digging wells in poor areas of the world, all of which are great altruistic acts that people do that aren't even Christians. I mean, there are a lot of people who do those kinds of things. But what separates the church from all those other organizations is that we have the good news. So it's not just about covering the soles of their feet. It's about saving souls, their eternal soul. And so it's something more significant than just meeting a physical temporary need. It's meeting that temporary need for the purpose of bringing them the gospel, the truth, so that they may have a relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ. And so I think that's what makes it all effective.
Yeah, quite a balancing act. And I think when you're trying to organize that or systematize that across large fellowships, I imagine there's a lot of challenges in getting the nuancing right in that way, because I've heard it said, and I get a bit poetic just for a little bit here. So I'm bouncing off your souls and souls little trope there. So I figure if you can
Yeah,
do it,
right.
um,
Sure.
I think true love without truth is just sentimental, and truth without love is sterile. I thought
Yeah.
that's I mean that was out of a song, but I get the theme that it's going on. Do you find that sort of sentiment to hold true? Do you think that's accurate in evangelism?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Speak truth in love. Jesus taught us, and so the scriptures tell us that's the approach we need to bring. And a lot of people will try to bring truth, and if they don't have love with it, if it's not motivated by love, they oftentimes can do more damage than good, because it comes across as pure judgmental, kind of a a legalistic, religious kind of banter that ends up turning people off to Christianity and to the gospel.
Yeah.
But when you come with love, when you have a genuine care for somebody. In other words, I'm not just trying to tell you your lifestyle or your choices or whatever else are wrong. I'm trying to save you from where your behaviors will lead you, because the reason the guardrails are up, the laws of God, the truths of God are there, is to keep us out of the ditches, to keep us free. A lot of times people see laws as take away our freedom. Well, the laws of God are actually like the guardrails on a side of a road. They're keeping you on the road so that you can continue to drive. And when you break through those guardrails and you ignore the guardrails, then you end up in a ditch, and that's much less free than when you're on the road driving. And so a lot of people, I think, misuse or misunderstand the laws of God or the truth of God as if it's slavery and bringing you into bondage, and it's really just the opposite.
Well, I think we can see that just in reflection in our own lives. The more we study the Word, the more that we renew our minds by washing it with the Word and taking on that understanding of God's law and God's grace. You can see that all of it is, I guess, constructed or created from God's love. I mean, that
Right.
to me, as you've described it, is a great sales pitch. I don't like those words, but like to some degree, that's how the Western mind sort of thinks a little bit. And I'm wondering from within your online work, you're probably quite familiar with a lot of other folks out there, although content creators may get a bit overwhelmed with just the nature of their own work. Have you seen good examples of people putting that online? Not that everything should be put online. I think we're a bit overdone in that way. But, people give examples of street preachers, X, Y, Z, something happens, a bit of clickbait, and some people are quite strident and others are a bit different. Have you seen good examples of call it the classic street evangelism for want of excluding other sorts at the moment? Do you see any of that demonstrated?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some guy. I can't recall names of the videos. It seems like even someone, and I may even get in trouble mentioning Francis Chan, because some people don't agree with every theological view and way he's gone. But I do remember Francis Chan, for example, putting out a video of doing individual evangelism in a very loving, kind of caring way, just kind of walking somebody through the gospel. And he asked them if he could film it so that people could watch your discussion and get permission, and then he would just allow people to hear him to kind of walk through the gospel with somebody. And he's very compassionate. He allows questions and he answers questions, and he just kind of walks people through. And that was one example that just came to mind when you said that. The Way of the Master, what's his I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Ray Comfort. Yeah, he's got a lot of videos out there where he does, street evangelism and all kinds of things, and most of those things that I've seen from him have been really top notch as well, as far as his ability to kind of walk people through the gospel and bring them to a point of decision.
Yeah, and I was thinking, Ray Comfort, being from New Zealand, he's someone that folks know in Australia quite well. He did a lot of work here before heading over. I think he's in Cali, I believe, these days.
Southern California,
so no rain there. But there he is anyway, poor chap. Can't help himself. But I remember him having a large effect on the Australian churches that he would visit, Not with regard to being like the big tent evangelist. He was nothing like that, but being someone who modeled and said, he had engaging techniques to talk about the law and grace at the same time. And he has a very winsome manner about himself. That and a small dog, always very helpful to get to know people.
With sunglasses, yeah.
Well, and
With
it
sunglasses.
never hurts when you're in the States to have an accent like yours, or an accent like Ray's, because automatically you were kind of drawn in by your accent. So that always helps too.
That's great. Then people can hate you for the message later.
Yeah,
Understand?
right.
Great. So looking at, Ray gave us this chance and to sort of look at things in the States at the moment, and from your vantage point, and you've got a bit of a rare vantage point in the role that you're currently sitting in. And what do you see as the current state of play for evangelism in evangelical America and beyond that as well? But we'll start there.
Well, I mean, obviously, our culture's become more secularized. Pluralism is on the rise, which is the concept and idea that all paths really lead to heaven. Relativism. Your way is just as good as my way. We all have our own way. But I think one particular study recently, and I meant to pull it up and try to find it before this interview, and I wasn't able to do so, but it could be found probably pretty easy with a Google search, where people are asked what, even Christians, born again, people who claim to be born again believers, think about evangelism or believe about evangelism. And over 50% of them felt like it was too much like proselyting, and that it wasn't appropriate to try to convince other people of your faith. In other words, more and more people in this culture are seeing evangelistic efforts as an imposition, like you're imposing your view onto me, and that's not appropriate in this culture. It's like you're supposed to keep your views to yourself, and it's fine if you want to be a Catholic and I want to be a Protestant, you want to be a Baptist or a Lutheran or whatever else, but let's just keep whatever you are to yourself. Let's not try to go out there and convince people to come to our side, so to speak. And it is seen as kind of the proselyting. It's seen as sales pitchy. You're trying to convince people to believe and follow you. This generation is so used to being sold something.
Yeah.
Every single product out there is spending billions of dollars trying to get the attention of this generation. Through their phones and televisions and everything else, and then you've just got one more voice among them, the church, also trying to vie for the attention of the culture and the people, and so it gets mixed in with that voice, and it just comes across as another sales pitch. Somebody else trying to get my money, somebody else trying to get my attention, someone else trying to get my time, and so I always try to emphasize when we're doing evangelism training is that what separates us from the world is that our motivation has to be that of love, not our own selfish gain. Like we're not doing this to grow our church body and our bottom line. If that is our ultimate goal underneath it all, this generation will see right through that, and they'll see that your goal is just to get more tithe and bigger churches and all these kinds of things, rather than to win people into the kingdom. And so it's about growing the kingdom versus growing your local church. And that motivation has to be from God. That has to be spirit led. That has to be something that's driving you, and even being willing to know that when you're inviting somebody to Christ, you may not even be getting them to come to your church, because that's really not what it's about. It's about inviting them to Christ, not to just your local body.
Yeah, I think those. Yeah, Steve, chip in by all means.
Look, I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts are. Like for me personally, having come from, both Phil and I came out of a fairly large Pentecostal church here locally, and we were doing an apologetics ministry there for a long while, and eventually the church really didn't feel comfortable with the apologetics ministry, because I think we were beginning to touch on, because our idea was always, look, we want to equip people to be more effective with our own evangelism, and at the same time we also had this idea that no question is off limits. Like if people ask a question, then we have to deal with it, and
Right.
maybe we won't have the answer, but we at least have to engage.
Yeah.
And we wanted to engage with all the different questions that people had, because we felt in some sense also that the church wasn't doing that. They, of course, they had a certain mission. It was a very particular mission. They were very focused on their mission. And it sort of gradually we realized that we actually weren't really fitting in that mission in that sense. And so, and my sort of, if you like, take from the broad church community largely, this is here in Australia, probably just the same as it is in America, as you have this sort of gradual, if you like, hostile takeover from some mega churches that move into town. And because they're hip, their music is great, they look good, the style is right, the people are all dressed with swanky suits on stage, and they take over the small churches as they turn into a big town, just by the fact that people think, oh, well, they must be much better, and these other small churches, they disappear. But what the flavor that I think would often, and I'm not tarring everybody with the same brush, I'm just raising a concern, I suppose, is that this, which is what you just also alluded to, this multi-level marketing kind of concept that has invaded the church. The church is almost like the new Amway, or I don't know what they're all called, right? And because I had several friends in the course of my life join various different multi-level marketing schemes, and those schemes, broadly as they are, they've destroyed the relationship, because they turned me into their new customer, and because I didn't want to be their customer, it kind of soured the relationship. And I'm kind of concerned that this is also a lot what happens in the modern church, because the church has become such a big beast that needs an immense amount of money, and it has to focus therefore on a very narrow message. Not that the gospel isn't to some degree narrow, but it's more the message of the church in order to feed the machine, to get people in the door, rather than, as you rightly said, that evangelism is about the sake of winning the person to Jesus, not winning them to, whatever church organization you're in.
Right. Yeah. Well said. And it can become a kind of there's some illustration I remember reading in a book about church growth, talking about a grease factory, and how you probably remember, you may remember the story, but it's a factory that makes grease for these other factories to be able to run. And it keeps getting bigger and bigger to the point eventually where it only makes enough grease to run itself. And so it just becomes this, self, and it compares that to the church, how the church can be outwardly focused, meeting the needs of the community and doing and helping. And eventually it becomes so beastly, if you will, so huge that it only has enough to really sustain itself. And that's when it turns inward and becomes an inwardly focused body. Some of the best churches are usually churches within their first 7 years of life, because they are outreach focused and meeting the needs of people, and they're not so concerned about the big buildings and the lights and the cameras and the like you said, the show side of things. They're all about growing. We got to get the numbers up. We got to get people. We got to reach people. And so sometimes churches lose that first love, that focus that they have on the community and on others, and they become, so inward focused that they really don't help their community, and they're really not serving the community anymore. They're basically serving the machine themselves.
Yeah. And is there any way that the work that you do has a voice to raise that as a flag of awareness? Do you have that kind of influence in your sphere to have those cautionary tales?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when we're speaking and doing trainings, and even podcasts like this, I can talk about those kinds of things and warn about those kinds of things. We also have departments within our convention that are about revitalization and regrowth. Sometimes replanting is the focus of that work, where a consultant will go in and help a church to revision or replant because they have become, they're dying off, or they're not reaching people or whatever, and they realize they're not going to survive if they don't change course, and so they reach out to the denomination for help, and we're glad to help them because we have training and people who've actually turn churches around and do that for a living, and they can go in and help them. But a lot of churches, they don't want to do the hard work, or either that or they're not willing to really change when it comes to growth. They want to grow, but they don't want to change, and so that's just not a possible scenario. You've got to be willing to change in order to grow, and so sometimes it's coming in with a hard reality to some of these churches and helping them to see where, show them a mirror and saying, this is really what you look like. I know this is what you think you look like, maybe based upon the way you were in the 80s or the 70s or even before, but this is the way you really look to your neighbor, and this is what's got to start changing.
Gee, Leighton, that there really is quite a potent service to have, because any bureaucracy that grows, like any administration that becomes a bureaucracy, does tend to be self-perpetuating and self-reinforcing. And the idea that you brought up, that folks have an image about what they think their church looks like versus versus reality, particularly with regards to say the state of their evangelism and apologetics, and I guess their lived culture. It can be hard for people to be self-reflective in a corporate body. A little bit of the Bay of Pigs type of thinking might come in there a little bit. You get the yes crowd who think we're doing things, and then maybe people showcase what the church thinks it's doing on a Sunday morning. So those in the pews are like, it's just a great church. I don't really have to do that much because someone else is doing it for me. The professionals are out there making it work. Look, I'm wandering into this particular discussion where we've talked about some of that structuring that can work for or against evangelism and apologetics. I also bring in this mix. I mean, that's sort of the internal, but the external. You've alluded to the external a fair bit already, but I wonder if we might drill down a little bit and see if there's any specific threads that need different approaches, perhaps. But how the current radical social trends, all those isms, how are they affecting or impacting on evangelism, do you think? And that's got an in and out of the church focus as well.
Well, oftentimes it depends on the ism. Obviously, some of the isms have to do with deep theological and even doctrinal distinctions that are crucial, depending on what ism it is you're talking about. But there's all kinds of cultural focuses. The most recent controversy in Southern Baptist world, has to do with egalitarianism versus complementarianism, two isms, which has to do with women's roles in ministry. And do you call a woman in ministry? Do you ever call her a pastor or not? Is it just a senior pastor? Is that the only thing reserved for the male? Or what about a children's pastor? Can that be a female, or should you just call her a children's director? And so that's a whole debate right now that's going on in the Southern Baptist world. And then what's referred to as woke, you might call it a wokeism. If you wanted to use ism there, which is with the critical race theory questions and the debates over how the church speaks to cultural issues with regard to race, and some of the Black Lives Matter movement that went through our culture back, especially during the COVID times, and all those kinds of how you even handle COVID, even though that's you'd think that that's just an illness issue or a health issue, but really became a political issue, very politicized. And one that split a lot of churches and caused a lot of grief within churches, especially pastors having to deal with people in their church that were split over how to deal with masks and all those kinds of things. And so these can all be seen as distractions from the main thing. They can all be seen as things that get in the way of what we're really there for. And that's what good leaders have to do. Good leaders have to bring the attention back to the main thing, to get their folks talking again and thinking again about what does it mean to reach the community for Christ? What does it mean to make disciples? How are we doing that? And if we're so focused on these secondary issues and all these other questions, then sometimes we can lose our focus on the more important matters. And I think that good leaders are going to point that out and continue to bring their congregation back to focusing on what the gospel really focuses on.
Yeah, and I certainly understand that as a thrust, and I think the challenge goes very deep though to do that. So if you look at what was happening, Steve, I see that Power of Hope finger coming up there. So why don't you take it first while you've got that?
No, I just wanted to say that I think that one thing that I noticed is obviously we do a lot of apologetic stuff. We do a lot of videos, and sometimes we do videos on critiquing some of the really, let's just say, the outer fringes of Christianity that should be critiqued, but we don't. But we're mindful that we don't want that to be our bread and butter. That's not why we started our channel, and so. But the thing that I think concerns me, because I see that a lot in the comments, sometimes I will say, I'll use language like, I suggest you should think like this. In other words, I'm not trying to tell people you must think like this, because my aim when I make videos is to make people think and not teach them or not tell them what to think, but just simply get them thinking themselves. Right. and working through the issues. But there is this kind of need, I think, in the Christian community to make everything the main thing. In other words, whilst Christians may have the gospel right, there are still many Christians who have the gospel right who make every single item in the Bible a gospel issue, rather than actually realizing that the New Testament is fairly explicit on, what is a heretical issue, as in what's a heretical belief, what are the things that you need to believe to be a Christian. And once you got that right, like, do you believe Jesus is the Son of God? Do you believe that he rose from the dead? Those kind of things. Once you've got those things right, then you've got to learn, I think churches don't do a very good job at this broadly, is teaching their members that what you believe about the rapture, as an example, doesn't make you or unmake you a Christian. And there are issues where, we might have a difference of opinion between, let's say a Lutheran and a Presbyterian and a Baptist. So there are denominational distinctions. But then within those denominations, there are people with hundreds of, I'd say, there's probably as many opinions about theological matters as there are bums on seats in the church. And to help people to realize that it's okay to have different views. And I think, I think apologetics is a real desperate need, especially now, because the world is so, if you look at the political, the cultural arena in the world, people are at each other's throats over stuff that 20, 30 years ago we wouldn't have bat an eyelid over. And now we're almost willing to, slaughter each other over those things. And sadly, I see that this has also invaded the church. The church needs to, I think, learn how to do what I would call triage about theology, so that we can, my sort of limited church history knowledge demonstrated like two great examples of people who disagreed on a secondary issue and yet did evangelistic work together. That was George Whitefield and John Wesley. And I've read the letters going back between them on Calvinism versus Arminianism, right? And they actually, I think, were a lot closer to each other than what people realize. But they worked together. When they got on stage to preach the gospel, they put those differences aside and realized there's a crowd of people who need to hear, but who need to know Jesus. And they got on with the job. And the awakening that occurred in America there, this is my limited view, of course, wasn't so negatively affected. Like today, we could learn a great deal from those two men, that we could have different views on things and yet still get on with each other, agreeably disagree, rather than just disagreeing in hostility. That's something that I really lament. And it's sometimes, where I'm almost like, should I even do apologetics on like on a YouTube channel? I still think it's really important, so continue to do it. But it's lamentable that there's so much hostility, and I wonder what your take is there in terms of how to deal with that well.
Yeah, it's a mark of maturity to be able to entertain a thought without necessarily accepting it, and also to be able to cordially discuss differences of opinion. That's a mature person. Anybody who's been married for any length of time knows that you have to learn to compromise. You have to learn to get along with each other, despite the fact that you see things very differently as a man and a woman.
Right.
And you're different personalities, but you can still be married to somebody you fundamentally disagree with over particular secondary issues in your marriage. And the same is true if you have children, you have parents, you have siblings, you have aunts and uncles. All of us have the Thanksgiving meals here where, you're around the table with all of your friends and family, and you've got to learn to get along, even though you don't all politically agree with each other or religiously agree with each other or all those kinds of things. That's a mark of maturity, to be able to get along with people who don't hold the same views that you hold to. That doesn't mean those views aren't important.
No.
And that's what's so important about this. My wife happens to be a family marriage therapist, and one of the things she has talked about before is that you can't just ignore or sweep under the rug differences of opinion. Or if one spouse thinks, well, you know what, I want unity, so I'm just not going to bring up this thing that's really bothering me. I'm just going to bury it. Everybody knows that's a recipe for disaster, because what's going to happen after that festers and becomes more and more, of a problem? Eventually, that person's probably going to blow up on the other person. You end up having major problems when people haven't learned to discuss their differences in a mature and Christ-like way. You can confront in love. You can confront because you love. And so, for example, we've mentioned Calvinism, and I'm a former Calvinist now. I was a Calvinist, and so I try to confront my Calvinist friends in love and say, even when we're done with this conversation, we may not agree with each other, probably won't agree with each other, but that's okay. We still love each other. We can still do ministry together. We can still worship together, and that doesn't mean that this issue's not important and that we can't discuss it or that I can't disagree with you about it. But it doesn't have to be something that divides us or distracts us from more important matters.
I think that's always the maturity we need to get to and strive to get to, with the help of the Holy Spirit, isn't it really? Just to be able to focus on the lordship of Christ and proclaiming Him, so that He can build His church, not we build our churches. I'm just wondering, just probably finally, we'll let you get on with the rest of your afternoon and evening after this, Leighton. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
But just a really, from the street kind of question. In Australian politics, we call it the pub test question. We don't have bars in Australia, we have pubs, and I typically don't go to them because they're pubs. A lot of people do. But how can we do apologetics better?
Like I said, I think earlier, it has to come from the motivation of love. It really does, and people can see that. People sense that. No matter what you say or how good you are at arguing with people, or you can have every verse memorized. We mentioned Ray Comfort before.
Yes.
If you'll notice, Ray, when he's talking to people, he has this spirit about him, this winsomeness about him, that it really does feel like, and I believe I don't believe he's acting. I believe it's true. I really feel like Ray cares about the person he's talking about too.
Yeah.
He's talking to this person. I mentioned Francis Chan earlier. I really felt Francis deeply cared for the person across the table from him. I felt it. And so I think they see that too. I think they sense that. If you're just trying to get them through a sales pitch, you're just trying to regurgitate some information, you're trying to win the argument versus win the relationship, people sense that. And so It's great to do apologetics training. It's great to help people learn the Roman road, for example, or some kind of an evangelistic strategy of here's what you say in order to help people to understand the truth. Great to do all that kind of training, but you can't train people to love. That comes from prayer. That comes from our own personal relationship and growth with Christ. Only Christ can teach you to really love unconditionally. And because in my nature, I'm just be honest with you guys, when I watch the 24-hour news cycles and I watch lost people acting lost, and it shouldn't surprise us that lost people act lost, but sometimes we get surprised by that, don't we? And they're saying dumb things, and they're being politicians, and they're being the opposite of whatever political party I am. They're saying things I don't agree with, and they're stepping on my values. Those Californians are moving over here to Texas, and they're voting like the Californians, and they're going to change our state, and we get mad and angry. It's easy to get angry at lost people for acting lost. It's a whole nother thing to do as Jesus did there in that passage I was reading from, where he looks upon them like lost sheep without a shepherd. He has compassion, it says, for them. And I naturally, Leighton doesn't feel that way about lost people. That only comes from Christ. And so the closer I am to Christ, the more I can love people unconditionally. I can know Christ died for them. Christ wants to save them. Christ has provided the means of their salvation. Therefore, I can be patient with whatever views they hold to, and I can show them compassion and not try to convince them to believe everything that I believe, or to follow my politics, or to follow all of my religious nuances, but instead just focus upon Christ and his love and his provision, and focus on the main thing first and foremost. And that's really, I think, the key to doing apologetics and evangelism better.
That's great. Yeah, thanks, Leighton. That was a wonderful wrap up, wonderful summary of that. It's I feel very encouraged coming back to those points, rather than looking at all the troubling and the teasing points and the nuancing and the splitting of the hairs. When we bring it back down to first principles to remind us that evangelism and apologetics is an act of love, and that really can only come from the Holy Spirit. Couldn't drum that up if I was paid to drum it up. There's no resource in me naturally that does that, but it's true. Sinner's got to sin, and Christians got to love. That's just how we roll. Steve, did you have any final thoughts, questions, comments to chip in before we head off?
No, probably only just again, this is something I probably lament, is that Christians, I think, especially since the advent of COVID, divide over politics more than over theology, and I find that really, really sad. And it's gotten to the point where Christians don't want to talk to each other, oh, you took the vaccine, or you didn't take the vaccine, therefore you're a Christian, or you're not, depending on which side you're talking to. And I've got friends who did and who didn't, and and I also have people in my friend circle who want to divide over those things, and people who don't, and it's just like, wow, like there's an immense amount of work to be done in the church in this regard, and it's not a time to sitting on your butt, so to speak, but it is lamentable that I think the church should be a place where people can come to have rest, to have peace, to not be embattered by the world, so to speak. And it seems like we've rather than saying, look, this is worldly behavior that stays out of the church, we're not allowing this kind of behavior in the church. We need to represent, model the behavior of Jesus. What would he have done in the circumstances?
That's
he
right.
would certainly have not done what I've seen in the last 3-4 years occur all across the Western countries of the world. And irrespective of whether you like the current president, the prime minister, or whatever, just the degree of hostility, I think, is something that we need to get rid of, because otherwise we just simply lose our witness to Christ. It doesn't matter what views we have.
Yeah. Well, level heads need to prevail, and that I think that's going to come from the church and those of us I think who hold to
Yes.
the principles of truth and righteousness, speaking truth in love, like we talked about before. I wish more of our leaders followed those kinds of examples. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bombastic and crazy folks out there that are leading our country, and people who I just can't understand that. I really can't. With as many good men and women out there in the world who do have level heads, who are
I know, why aren't they there?
why they are the last
Where are
ones
they?
picked to lead our countries. I do not know why that is, but it is a baffling thing for me. It makes me crazy thinking about it. 'Cause-
Don't
Yeah,
go
I know.
to-
Sometimes you think of the 20 million people in Australia, that's all you could find.
yeah, no, that's the best
Surely
you
there
got.
must be somebody else.
This is the best you got. Come on, come on.
No. We're going through a thing that's testing the church at the moment in Australia. There is a nationwide referendum, and we don't do many of them. This is for a change to the Constitution, and it's a political move to enshrine what they call an Indigenous Aboriginal voice to Parliament, and people have seen right through it as being a divisive policy because it's enshrining a kind of apartheid. And without getting into the deeps of it, of course, that has split people in the church left and right as well.
Oh.
Some people are looking at the mechanism and some people are looking at the emotion and going side by side. So it's a wonderful reminder for us, Leighton, just to take on board that encouragement that you've given us to stay on track, to keep the first things first, and to maybe grow up a little bit and be mature, and loving in our conversations with each other.
There's a good reason, I think, that the scriptures say you will know them by their love for each other. It doesn't say you'll know them by their doctrinal fidelity. They'll have this list, this list of check marks of, they believe this doctrine, they believe this doctrine. Okay, that's how you'll know if they're really Christian. You will know them by how they treat each other, how they love one another. And that's a mark of maturity, people who can love people who they disagree with over secondary issues. And so that's often been more my go-to when I'm looking for people to follow and to lead. Mentors in my life. I'm looking for people who show the level of maturity, and I'm not wondering how they're getting along with their friends. I'm wondering how do they get along with their enemies? How are they getting along with people who disagree with them? Because if they can model the kind of behavior that Christ calls us to, then that's the kind of person I want to model my life after, and I want to follow because they seem to be following Christ.
That's great. Well, Leighton, all I can say is,
really important.
When I grow up, I want to be like you. That'll be seriously. So,
Aim much higher. Aim much higher.
Okay. 6'3". But anyway, thank you so much for joining us down under tomorrow, which it already is, of course, here. And as we get ready for our working day and you're wrapping up yours, we just want to thank you for your time and pray all the best for you and your family and your ministry. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, guys. Thank y'all for having me.
Our pleasure.